Happy Thursday, everybody. This is Brandon Busteed, President of University Partners and Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. And welcome to Bold Leaders in Learning. I'm excited today to have a chance to talk with one of my former colleagues and current friends, Dr. Ella Washington, who's a professor at Georgetown. She also runs her own company, whose name I love, Elevate Solutions, of course. So can't come up with a better name than that, Ella. And we're going to be talking today about diversity, inclusion, equity. I'm going to talk about a little bit through the perspective of her work that she's doing with companies and organizations of all types. We're going to talk specifically about higher education. But first of all, Ella, thank you for joining. It's great to see you, great to catch up with you. Please tell everybody a little bit about your own personal background and a little bit about the work you do, both as a professor and as a consultant.
Absolutely. Well, Brandon, always great to catch up with you. So thanks for having me. You know, my work really is at the intersection of both research and practice. And that's what I love to do. That's kind of been the story of my career. Even back at Gallup, it was much of the same. My work in the academic space really focuses on researching and understanding companies' organizational journeys around DE&I. And so oftentimes organizations will say, we know it's a journey, but what does that really mean? Because oftentimes leaders, the first question they'll ask me is, well, how do we compare to other companies, and what can we do right away for some of the quick wins? And so my research looks at, what does that journey look like? What does it entail? And how do you kind of activate on these lofty and well-intentioned goals? But what does that mean, over the course of time and challenges they may face? From a consulting perspective, I help organizations bring those thoughts to life, right? And so many organizations are looking to strategize in a meaningful way for the first time, surprisingly. Even organizations that have been very focused in the DEI space and have great programs and have great missions around DEI, they didn't have a strategic vision, and they hadn't taken a step back to think, how do all of these activities that we're doing connect? And so it seems like, with the current civil rights movement, we're seeing much more of that, taking a step back and thinking about who we want to be, how we want to show up. And then once we have clarity around that, how do we activate on it? And so that's kind of where my research and practice form a perfect marriage to me.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting combination, and it was one of the things that I know you and I connected on right away during our time at Gallup. And so I'd love to know, right? Give me some of the high-level takeaways from the last, say, 6 months of work you've been doing. Obviously, DEI was an important topic that was on the radar long before this pandemic, and in the context though of this year, right? We have had as much civil unrest around race, around socioeconomic status and clashes, right, with what's happening. Hard to imagine, a more tumultuous time. So, I know you've been very busy. I know you've been very in demand. Give us some sense of of what's happening out there, right? What are the big takeaways that you're seeing from the work you're doing with companies? Is this really different? Like, are they going to do anything different now? Or is this more of like, hey, this is an issue we've got to talk about and do something about? And are we just going to be back into the same old cycle of, ups and downs and the progress we're making on this?
Yeah, great question. So, it's interesting because my colleagues and I have been doing this work collectively over 30 plus years. So the work of diversity management, diversity and inclusion, and now diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, and all those great things, it's not new work. The impetus for the importance of the work is not new. And so it's very interesting, having my foot in the academic space as well as the practitioner space, hearing how the conversations often are not aligning. And so, back in June when Black Lives Matter had the resurgence, many corporations kind of had an awakening to the importance of having, strategy around diversity and inclusion, the importance of being transparent around their metrics, the importance of understanding their employee experiences. And, from a academic perspective, we've been doing this work again for over 30 plus years. And so what I think is different is I think it, feels like organizations really are understanding that it is going to take a long-term commitment in order to really be effective. I think in the past, there has been this sense of let's throw resources at it, let's throw money at this diversity and inclusion problem. And, I even see organizations talking about it a little bit differently now. Instead of that we have a diversity inclusion problem, it's they're really thinking more thoughtfully about how do we create a diverse and inclusive environment? How do we create a diverse and inclusive culture? And though it might seem like a small shift, it really does influence the way leaders are approaching this work, the way leaders are taking ownership of this work, and the way employees are, I think, experiencing the changes that are being made. And so that's what I would say are the major differences. But I do think it's a little too soon to tell. And so I think part of this is me being optimistic about, people being serious this time around, and that we won't have to have another civil rights resurgence for organizations to remain committed to their DEI goals.
Right. So I'm encouraged to hear that your sense is that they're acknowledging it as a longer term ongoing initiative as opposed to something that kind of happens more sporadically. And I think, well, I don't know, I'll take a little bit from what your comments, but correct me if I'm off in what I was reading into it. But it sounds like their organizations and leaders are also starting to look at this as an opportunity, right? Not just a problem they have to deal with, but like, if they can do this well, right? If they can really shift themselves to a position where, they make dramatic improvements in the feelings of inclusivity among current employees and a real effort to drive a different kind of talent pipeline and recognize talents in ways that they might not, it's an opportunity. Do you sense that they're starting to think about it as, I'll call it offense as opposed to playing defense? Do you sense that at all?
Absolutely. So I think that organizations that have taken the time and done the work to understand their current state. So, that's one of the first critical steps of this process is understand where we are, but also understand where we want to be. And I think in having those strategic conversations, they're starting to realize that we can be a bit more innovative in this space. We can use this to attract a talent pipeline. One of my clients just the other day was talking about how, they are hearing in interview processes that people are being attracted to their organization because they've heard of some of the DEI shifts they've made just in the past few months, right? And so,
interesting.
While organizations are trying to solve some of the previous challenges they've had, I think by thinking strategically about not what just we want to do today, but how we want to show up 5 years from now, helps them to have a better connected strategy. And I hope that continues because, there's often this conversation about the business case versus the moral case, but we know that it's both, right? And so we don't want to lose the impetus to be innovative through inclusion, to push what the boundaries of accepting all types of diversity means, just as a reaction to the current moment and, organizations feeling a sense of guilt that they hadn't engaged in this conversation previously.
Right. And you mentioned something to me right before we came on live about this notion of intersectionality. And I thought that was really intriguing. Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so, in much of the conversations that we have, first of all, when we say diversity, we usually mean demographic diversity. And specifically, we usually mean race, gender, and age, and, gender identity and sexual orientation. And while those aspects of diversity are certainly important, and oftentimes we consider those, the aspects that are most primary to the core of our identity, those aren't the only facets of diversity. And also, you are more than just one thing. So you're not just a woman, you're not just a Black employee. There's this, natural intersectionality that happens, but our conversations and our strategies around DEI haven't elevated to that level yet. They haven't activated on that. And I think organizations are still by and large struggling with that. They're really stuck in, well, what do we do about our gender problem? What do we do about, especially now, our race problem? But what's interesting is, after doing about 100 focus groups with organizations over the past 3 or 4 months, employees are really pushing the envelope. They want to be recognized for their intersectionality. If they see, demographic data that is just race and gender, they want to know, well, what percentage of the population are women that are people of color, right? And so I think organizations are having to pick up more quickly than they have in the past because employees are are feeling that need. And I do hope that, that push around intersectionality continues both in the practice space, but I think it also will propel what we know from a research lens around these intersections of identity.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It brings important nuances, right, in terms of how we think about the issue, and then also how people bring themselves into the issue. Because you're right, hardly anybody is, single dimensional in terms of thinking about those different pieces. When you start to layer in socioeconomic status and other types of background, right, it's encouraging to think that we might be kind of pushing the dimensions on how we think about this. And so I know largely you've done a lot of consulting recently with companies, and you work in higher education. You and I overlapped in some of the work we did at Gallup and higher education advising and some research there. I think most people would say, well, geez, colleges and universities are theoretically doing better on DEI because, they're organizations whose missions have been more closely aligned to, doing good and embracing people and elevating people from whatever, status they came to through this beautiful thing we call education. Tell me a little bit about your views of higher education, right? Is higher education out in front of other organizations or not so much?
Yeah, so I think it's this really interesting push and pull that I've started to think about since our conversations, Brandon. Higher education is out in front with things like student activism. So we have seen lots of student activism over the years, and that often is the push for organizations in the higher ed space to make changes, significant changes. And that's unique because I think you see in higher ed lots of grassroots efforts, as opposed to in the corporate space, they are struggling to resist top-down, efforts only. And how do they manage this top-down and bottom-up perspective that's needed? However, where higher ed struggles is there's lots of inertia. There's lots of, waiting and to see how things happen versus organizations are able to move much more quickly that we see. And so we see students wanting to see the organizations that they are students of move more quickly. And so I think there is this opportunity for them to learn from each other. And I don't think that that opportunity has been leveraged as much as it could have been.
Yeah, one of the things I was always interested in is, when you think about organizations, right, you have to think about the whole organization. You have to think about it as a culture. And, in higher ed, you've got students, you've got faculty, you've got staff, right? There's these, in a way, kind of different classes of employees, right? Who's the customer? Is it the faculty? Is it the faculty who think they're, the reason why it exists? Or is it the students? So there's some really fascinating dynamics there. But when we see universities report on things like what they're doing around DEI, it's usually through the lens of their student body, their student population, right? You're seeing a little bit of it to some degree. I don't want to be too critical about staff and faculty DEI initiatives, but that's an area where I think they've invested less time and energy. And some of that played out in some of the research that, that you and I observed in our time at Gallup, right? Where if you look at employee engagement across higher education, it's actually lower in terms of comparability to other organizations. In fact, colleges and universities are in the bottom quartile of Gallup's global employee engagement database, right? Which is not so great, right? And so, and then there's some interesting connections, as we know, between employee engagement and feelings of being part of an inclusive organization. And so, so higher ed is low on engagement. And for inside that metric, the faculty and staff who said they felt like they were part of an inclusive community, the biggest driver of them feeling that way was whether they felt their opinions at work were heard. So, it was an interesting insight to me because I had never really thought about diversity and inclusivity through the lens of opinions being heard. But of course, when you say it, that makes a lot of sense. Tell me a little bit about your reactions to why higher education engagement is so low, and maybe some of your thoughts on those linkages between feelings of inclusivity and some of the kind of basic management practices that we could improve upon in higher ed, right? I mean, this is about a dean or your manager making you feel like your opinion counts, that it's been heard, that they, so this gets down to a pretty tactical level pretty fast.
I remember when we were working together at Gallup, what was so surprising is how many institutions had been studying their student and alumni engagement and had never thought to study their faculty and staff engagement, especially on the staff side. And, we just thought it was such a big missed opportunity. And so not only were they at the bottom quartile of, our database at Gallup, but they also just weren't even surveying and understanding the inclusive experiences of their faculty and staff. And then once we, got a little bit granular with the data, we found out, because higher ed institutions are so full of hierarchy, oftentimes, staff members feel like their opinions aren't even asked, let alone count, right? And so because of that, it's a huge missed opportunity. Higher ed institutions, of course, should focus on the student experience, but they can't neglect the fact that they are not only serving students, they're serving their workforce, just like any other organization. And without that lens of, how do we make sure our faculty and our staff and our students all feel engaged and feel like they're included, it's a missed opportunity, and we can't really say we're a DEI focused organization. And so, as far as opinions count, I think that institutions have to be a little bit more creative in terms of what that looks like because of the hierarchy that exists, right? And so, the hierarchy is there, and that is the nature of being an academic institution. However, that doesn't mean you can't provide opportunities for employees and staff members specifically to feel like their opinions not only count, but they're being valued and considered in the decisions that are made at the higher levels of the institution.
Yeah, and I've said this often, if you want to drive student engagement, what's the big driver of that? It's staff and faculty engagement. So, these things are not separate, right? They shouldn't be looked at as separate things. They're all part of that same culture, right? That overall culture. And there's different nuances within that are important to note. But, that's an area I think where higher education has a long way to go. And you're right, to some degree, even though they've been more, I'll call it mission inspired and mission aligned to DEI work than, say, your typical company, they may or may not have moved swiftly on certain actions, right? And so, this is something that I think there's some real room for innovation in higher ed and room for considerable action, right, is to embrace the whole community and your thinking around that. We also spent a lot of time dissecting data on the student experience related to the type of organization, type of university they were in. And some of the exciting findings that you and I talked a lot about were from the Gallup Purdue Index, looking at, the study of college graduates and looking at their long-term outcomes in work and their overall well-being linked to the experiences they had or didn't have in college. And one of the huge insights from that study was that Black graduates from historically Black colleges and universities were several times more likely to say things like they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams, to say that the professors at their alma mater cared about them as a person. So these really important kind of emotional support metrics were off the charts for Black graduates from HBCUs compared to Black graduates from any other type of university, which we could just call PWIs, right? Predominantly white institutions for basic categorization. So, there's a lot that we could unpack there, but tell me a little bit about your thoughts about that. On one hand, I don't think that was a surprising finding. How big the differences were, though, it was both a great compliment to HBCUs and a really disappointing finding for the rest of higher ed. So just tell me some of your thoughts and reactions to that data.
Yeah, well, one piece of the data that you didn't mention there is not only what the student experience was while they were there, which is certainly important, but they're reporting of them thriving after the fact. So just this notion of, being in a space where I feel like I belong and I am not the other, right? Or I am not the minority, not only contributes to how much I enjoy my academic experience, how much I learn and grow, how much I retain, how well I do academically, but also how much I thrive later in life. I mean, who wouldn't want to emulate that in some way at all schools for all students, right? And so I think there's something kind of magical in that space. And I can speak from personal experience, having been a graduate of a historically Black institution, Spelman College, that you do feel a sense of belonging that is very unique. And oftentimes critics of HBCUs will say, well, it's not a reflection of real life. But I think our data really rejected that notion when it said, that students thrive after the fact. And so it's not about being a reflection of real life. It's, getting that sense of confidence at a young age, having professors that care about you and are invested in your future in a different way. And now we know at PWIs that there are fantastic professors of all backgrounds that do care about students. But, I think there's something different about how diversity and inclusion is embraced and talked about. And it's not an otherness that students feel. I mean, I wonder how you would reflect on your experience at Duke as a comparison.
Well, you and I traded some notes on this, but I'll give my personal, view, which is a Duke example. But I think my broader statement is not a Duke specific example. It's a pretty standard statement for most PWIs, right? Which is, let's just call it writ large, most of higher education. And the reality is that in my memory, right, I could be off on this, but I thought through every professor that I had at Duke University. And I can think of one professor who was African-American, right? And it happened to be a class I took on African-American history. So, but to think about that, right? To step back for a minute, as a white male at the time, I don't know that I was doing a careful audit of that, and paying like, oh, wow, geez, it's easy not to notice those things, which is an embarrassing point to even, consider. But, in looking back at it, I realized I went through college and almost went all the way through college without having a single Black professor, right? And, now there was diversity in other respects, certainly in terms of the different types of professors I had, international, male, female, right? Other races. So, okay, great on that front. But then you think about the difference of an HBCU and, you largely have, it's impossible, as we kind of summarize, it's impossible for a student to go through an HBCU and not have had multiple Black professors, right? And so that's a really big difference. And so if I, were to put myself in the other shoes, right, and think of going to college and, being a minority in college and having no white professors and all kinds of stuff like that, yeah, I would have felt very differently about my experience. And I think that's something that we have to be increasingly more attentive to, because it's easy for those of us who are white to lose track of that and not really understand the otherness factor.
Well, and I also think it's a missed opportunity because, many college students that are minorities at PWIs will say they feel tokenized and they feel like they're used for flyers and statistics. And much of that is around diversity, right? Demographic diversity, which we know is important, but, demographic diversity alone is not enough to create an inclusive environment. We see that in the corporate space, and we certainly see that in the higher ed space as well. And I challenge many higher ed institutions to not only think about just the amount of diversity you have, but what is the lived experience of the student on campus? What is the lived experience of those diverse students in the classroom? Even if you have a 10% population across campus alone, for example, a business school, how many minority students are represented in those classes? And so when you start to think about the actual experience of inclusion and the lived experience of these students, you then can start to understand why it's about much more than diversity, and not that just demographic diversity, again, by itself is the only factor we're considering. But, as the data show from HBCUs, there seems to be a difference in experience and also life outcomes. I would say that one of the most touching moments so far in my teaching career was a student that reached out to me unsolicited and said, hey, they were a Black student, and they said, you're the first Black professor I've ever had, and I'm a graduating senior this semester.
Wow.
And, it's just one of those moments, especially reflecting back to my experience in a HBCU as a student, that I never said that. I never had to say that, right? And so it makes me feel good, but it certainly also makes me a bit sad that they would have that experience at, such a diverse and welcoming institution like Georgetown, but the demographic numbers are what they are.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this distinction between demographic diversity, right, and inclusivity. I feel like, at least in the conversation I've been involved in, we lump D&I together, right? We lump DEI together as just a nice catch-all phrase. And yet there's some really big differences and nuances there. Like, yes, it's hard to create demographic diversity. That's not an easy task, right? To have a diverse set of students, a diverse set of faculty, a diverse set of employees like that. I don't want to downplay how difficult and important that is, but we know there's lots of examples where there's demographic diversity, but there's very little inclusiveness. And one of the other insights that we were talking about was from the Gallup Purdue Index was that for Hispanic graduates from HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, the same was not true as it was for Black graduates from HBCUs, in that there were not increasingly better experiences among Hispanic graduates from HSIs. And we first saw that, it was a real, like, why is that the case? And then one of the distinctions I didn't know back then, I do now, was that, HBCUs have been classified as such because of their historical mission and purpose, right? HSIs have been classified by the percentage of students who are enrolled there who are Hispanic students, right? And so there are institutions who became an HSI last year, let's say, because of the percentage of students enrolled there. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have purposely set out to build a culture, right, have a mission and purpose to serve those students. And so, that's then where you can start to say, oh, okay, I can understand why that was true for HBCUs and Black graduates, but it wasn't for HSIs and Hispanic graduates. So, a lot to unpack there, but I think it goes back to one of the things you mentioned. Unless there's a real institutional mission and purpose commitment, right? Like, can we get to inclusivity if it isn't an institutional mission and purpose?
No, I don't think you can, because ultimately, you can increase your demographic diversity, but if people don't feel that they belong within the organization, if they don't feel like they're valued for who they are as unique individuals, but also that they fit as a part of the larger community, whether we're talking in higher ed spaces with students and faculty and staff, or we're talking about in the corporate space, we see these diversity efforts almost fail. And, we see so much kind of frustration on the parts of leaders that feel like they have done everything they can on the diversity front, but not understanding why they're not seeing, more diversity in the leadership ranks, right? And they said, when we have these great pipeline programs, what's happening? You have to stop and think about inclusion. It really is kind of the crux of success in shifting cultures around DEI. And it's interesting that I think organizations are in the past 5 years have just started to break apart this marriage of diversity and inclusion kind of being all in one breath. It's something that I've talked a lot about, and that's why you see many companies start to say inclusion and belonging, or inclusion, diversity, and equity, and kind of switching up the letters as a signal that we are really focused on inclusion. Not that we're forgetting about demographic diversity; it's still important. It always will be.
Right.
But inclusion is I would say, increasingly at the forefront of organizations' minds, and I think that higher ed could learn a bit from that. In the corporate space to start to think even more about inclusion.
Yeah, so I know we're almost out of time. On that note, if you had, you're in a role where a lot of organizations, in some cases, are coming to you for the first time and saying, we need to do something. Well, what do I do? How do I get started, right? And you mentioned that they always want to know, like, how do I compare to others? And I'm just curious, somebody who calls you out of the blue and says, Ella, where do we start? What's your recommendation on the best first step a leader can take towards building a more inclusive culture?
Yeah, so I would say, in the higher ed space and in the corporate space, it's really important to establish a unified vision. So recognizing that the DEI journey and from an organizational perspective may be different from the individual leadership journey, and understanding that, you have to understand and be very clear where you want your organization to go, what we want to be in this DEI space. On the higher ed side, I've read many very dense DEI institutional strategies, pages and pages of great stuff, lots of research, lots of goals. But then when you ask someone from their key leadership team, so what are we really trying to accomplish? there are 10 different answers, right? And so we see
Right.
that in the corporate space as well. And so having a unified vision, and then leaders being able to understand how they can play a part in that unified vision, not that it's just the chief diversity officer's role or it's the HR person's role, but it's all of our responsibility to figure out how to activate on this vision, is the first thing I would say. I would say the second thing that higher ed specifically can learn is to reassess and realign often. I mean, I think higher ed actually has the opportunity, especially on the student side, to be super innovative, because you have, what we would call in the corporate space turnover of your
Right.
student population every 4
Yeah.
to 5 years. And so
Yeah.
why not try some innovative things? Why not experiment and see if you can push the needle, see if you can be innovative, instead of kind of falling into what we often see is in higher ed institutions, inertia, and being really slow to change. And then the last thing I would really tell my colleagues in the higher ed space is to make sure you're activating inclusive strategies for your workforce in addition to your student population. So,
Yeah.
we talked about the gaps in even measuring inclusion for faculty and staff. But now that we understand that there are those gaps, and not only are those gaps important for employees, experience working at those institutions, but they do impact student experience. It's all interconnected in this ecosystem of culture. And so I would certainly encourage higher ed institutions to start to pay more attention and to their workforce, and especially around inclusion.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join me amidst all the other folks who are desperately seeking your advice right now, and rightfully so. So appreciate your time. I'll look forward to having you back on the show and hearing more of your insights as your work evolves. But it was great to see you, and have a great rest of the week. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll catch you next Thursday.
Thanks, Brandon. See you later.